Hi guys, we're back with part 2 for lecture number 2, and I was talking about where the Spanish were settling in large numbers, and I mentioned that it was not largely in North America for the reasons I already mentioned, that there's just not a whole lot of easy wealth to be extracted from the North American continent. That doesn't mean the Spanish want to let it go. You'll see the Catholic missions. I've showed you a map of that before. St. Augustine will end up becoming a permanent Spanish settlement, which will of course later revert to English control. But we often refer to St. Augustine in present-day Florida as the first permanent European settlement in North America. So it's definitely important because it will be continuously occupied from that point forward. And thinking about the Spanish trying to get others to settle, especially in some of these sparsely inhabited regions of North America, we often look to the Encomienda system as a way in which the Spanish try to get more warm bodies to sit on top of their colonial territories so far away from the home country. So the Encomienda system was kind of like a pension benefit, if you will, or retirement benefit for members of the Spanish military. Encomenderos were granted the rights to land, a certain strip of land in the New World. They were also granted the rights to the labor of the native peoples on that land. Now, no one bothered to ask the Native Americans about this, so as you might expect, the Encomienda system didn't always really work out very, very well. Certainly not from the standpoint of the natives, who were essentially paid, or they weren't paid, but they were fed. They might have been given housing, but they were essentially slaves. So many Native Americans ran away from the system, rightfully so. And from the standpoint of the Spanish, the Encomienda system was never really all that successful for that very reason alone. And in addition to those natives who were fleeing, they were running away from the Spanish because they were being enslaved either to work in mines or diving for pearls, oysters in the Caribbean, putting to work just in a number of different ways on sugarcane plantations. Many of them, in addition to running away, were simply dying tragically in very, very large numbers. You can see the chart here that shows Native American populations taking a nosedive within just about 100 years of Columbus' first landing in the New World. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that the Native American populations, their immune systems had no resistance because they'd never been exposed to some of these European diseases that had been shared between Europeans and Africans and Asians through trade for hundreds and hundreds of years. Pathogens like pathogens that would lead to diseases like smallpox or tuberculosis or whooping cough. Those populations had had a chance to have their immune systems, cope with those diseases. Not so. This is first contact between so-called virgin populations whose immune systems were just ravaged by some of these diseases that might sicken Europeans or Africans or Asians but not kill them. It's going to kill native populations. We speak of this in a larger context as part of the Columbian Exchange, named after Christopher Columbus, who initiated unwittingly initiated this exchange. And it's going to include not just diseases, you can see from the map here, but also livestock. For instance, there were no horses in North America. Those were introduced by Europeans. There were no cattle, pigs, sheep. All these are so-called Old World livestock animals that are introduced into the Americas, along with several Old World crops, sugarcane, coffee, olives, these sorts of things. And then we do see some new animals and plants going the other way, coming from the New World, first being introduced into Europe and Africa and Asia. Most notably corn, a New World crop, tomatoes, cacao, one of my favorites because you get chocolate from that. So we do see this sort of bigger exchange going on here. And because of the very deadly effects of these European diseases, in some cases 90 to 100% of some of these tribes will die out completely. For Europeans who continue to come over and settle in the New World, they're losing their source of forced labor. All these enslaved natives are either running away or dying off in such huge numbers that Europeans start looking for alternative forms of forced labor. They will now begin looking to the continent of Africa. It will start with the Portuguese as early as the 1440s, landing on the Madeira Islands, the Canary Islands, just right off the coast of West Africa. They will begin initiating a trade with West African tribal chiefs. And the trade will be this. They're going to land on the shore. They're going to say, look, we need people to work growing sugar cane on some of these islands. Later on, once the so-called New World is found, then they want to take, they need laborers for the New World. We need laborers. These African tribal chiefs say that's no problem. They tap into their existing slave networks running into the interior of Africa. We can provide you with the people, and what we want in exchange, these African tribal chiefs, is we want access to modern weaponry. We want guns. We want cannons, right? All these things so that they could more successfully fight against other tribal chiefs back in Africa. So this begins a terrible process, what will later become known as the transatlantic slave trade. Once the New World colonies are established, they're now taking them all the way across the Atlantic Ocean. These men, women, and children, millions of them, stolen from Africa. And for those who are left, they're left in societies with all these new deadlier weapons coming in. So the existing warfare will turn even bloodier over time. So who knew that, Christopher Columbus unwittingly bumping into these new continents would lead to the decimation of not only Native American populations, but ultimately the decimation of West African populations through the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade. Now, moving forward, the French will be also interested in trying to secure colonies overseas. They see all these huge shiploads of gold and silver, these Spanish galleons making their way across the Atlantic back to the home country of Spain, and they want a cut of the pie, right? They want their chance to compete for some of the wealth possible in the New World. So we're going to see the French also getting in on this game. As early as 1534, 1535, they'll send Jacques Cartier, who will start to explore the mouth of the St. Lawrence Riverway. Beyond that, Samuel de Champlain will be coming in. We'll set up the settlement of Quebec, in fact, in 1608. And then a little bit later, beyond that, you'll see Robert de La Salle making his trip through what we call the Great Lakes. You can see on the map here, the Great Lakes. And then ultimately finding that huge, important waterway, the Mississippi River, that kind of bisects the continent, and he will navigate that all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. Realizing what an important waterway this is, what La Salle will do is he will claim all this territory, not just the Mississippi River, but a huge swath of territory surrounding it. He will claim all of that for his home country of France, and he will name it Louisiana after the king, King Louis XIV in France at that point in time. Now, with the French, they will set up a few isolated forts right alongside the Mississippi River, but they will not settle in any large numbers in what will become the United States. This because it's a hard living. They're looking for gold and silver. They're not finding it. Instead, the French will tend to concentrate their settlements in what we think of as present-day Canada, and a lot of that will have to do with the fur trade. Right, so where the French set up a permanent settlement in any decent numbers will be New France, as they call it, what we think of as present-day Canada, and this will be based upon what they can make money off of, which in many cases is trading with Native Americans for fur. Beaver pelts, moose hides, what have you. There's a tremendous demand for those back home in Europe. So the reason why I mention, French settlement in North America at all is even though they tend to be in the largest numbers in New France, they're not going to let go of this territory of Louisiana. The French won't. So that later on, when we see the English, who we're going to be turning to next, when we see the English coming in and settling along the East Coast, eventually the English will settle in large enough numbers that it's going to start to create competition for land and resources. So the English will start moving west. Well, guess what? They move west enough into the Ohio River Valley, and they're going to start impinging upon French land. From the standpoint of the French, they're going to start telling the English, back off, guys. We've already claimed all this territory. English settlers, meanwhile, are going to look out at that land on which there's virtually no Europeans settled on that, and they're going to say, well, if this is your land, where are you? We need the land. We're moving on to it regardless of what you think, France. So file this away. We're not to it yet. It's a number of lectures on down the line. But one of the reasons that's going to ultimately lead to a war between England and France will be competition for land in North America. The English pushing west into Louisiana, the French saying back off, this is our backyard, and the English saying no it isn't. It's going to be our territory now.